Thanks very much to everyone who has joined our call. This is Sasha Ramirez from PARIS21 speaking. We're delighted to see that so many people could join today. I think we have 182 so far, and the number still seems to be rising precipitously. We really appreciate you engaging with us today. We know it's a challenging time for everyone around the world, but we know this is an important topic that doesn't go to sleep just because we have other issues to face. So we really appreciate you taking the time to engage in this conversation with us, and we hope that you'll continue to have the conversation with us via our social media channels and via our websites on the OECD and PARIS21 respectively. So before I turn things over to my colleagues, I'll invite anybody who's joined who hasn't done so yet to take part in our poll. You can find that via the Q&A, via the poll function in Zoom. So please feel free to take part in that poll. I'll minimize it for now while I get started on the housekeeping notes. So before we start, I will just share a couple of housekeeping notes with you today. Please, we encourage you to rename yourself by the organization that you're representing, followed by your name. And you can do that via the participants panel and then right-click your name to change that. That's just so we know who's on the call. Kind of keep your microphone muted at all times. This is for panelists. Should you want to intervene, our moderator will be happy to call on you. We have limited time for Q&A, unfortunately, today because the panel only have about an hour for the discussion. So please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A window. If we don't have time to get to it today, then we will be pleased to follow up with you offline. Those of you who have interventions scheduled will be called on later by the moderator. And finally, if you have a technical question, please feel free to send it to us via the Q&A function, and a member of our team will follow up with you to provide you with support. Finally, I would like to let you know that we are recording today's webinar. If that's an issue for you, please take note, and we invite you to send us a message or to log off. With that, I'm pleased to turn things over to my colleagues Archita Misra from PARIS21 and Alejandro Guerrero from OECD, who will get things started for us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sasha. Hello, everyone. I'm Archita Mishra from PARIS21, and I hope this finds you well. I hope we find you well in challenging times today. Together with my colleague Alejandro Guerrero from the OECD, we will quickly unpack the topic of discussion today. So we're all 5 years into the SDG agenda, and there are efforts at the global, national, and local levels underway to deliver on the goals as part of the Decade of Action. This presents us with a great opportunity to align for all development actors to align our results frameworks, data, and systems for better decision making. At PARIS21, we work with national statistical systems to equip them with tools and resources and improve their data availability and quality to support the development agenda. In this process, we consistently observe a number of challenges related to the uptake of the SDG agenda relating to capacity, financing, and programmatic or policy alignment. For starters, here's a simplistic picture of how data ecosystems today look like and how they could be with better leveraging of the SDGs.
Thank you, Archita. My name is Alejandro Guerrero, and I'm part of the results community of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. Let me say a few words about this slide. So what we have observed in the last 5 years from the OECD is that the vast majority of countries have been working to align themselves and national statistics to the SDGs. But this is pretty much work in progress everywhere. For example, in Uganda and Samoa, they are able to collect at the moment with national statistics 45 SDG indicators out of the 232 that are out there. While some countries can collect more indicators than these two cases, those two cases are not exceptional by any means. This reflects the cost of aligning to the SDG framework. On the donor side, we have also observed that donors are integrating the SDGs into their own planning and in the monitoring and evaluation systems at country level. But in our research, what we found is that they are doing so in a partial way. The alignment with the SDGs is quite incomplete. With some exceptions, many of the monitoring systems often produce SDG data that is only usable for internal purposes. This is a one chicken and an egg puzzle. Is that the donors indicate that countries do not have the development data they need to measure their own impact. So they develop parallel systems to collect that data, but at the same time, there is a lack of donor collective action in investing in countries' statistical systems and data across the board. So individual solutions are often the rule. The current state of affairs leaves us with a situation in which governments and development partners lack the SDG data they need to manage for sustainable development. Today, we want to explore how the SDG framework could play a role in facilitating convergence and shared production of development data and statistics.
So to that end, we can think of 4 simple scenarios play out if we think about the behavior of national statistical systems on one hand and the donor community on the other with regards to SDG uptake at country level. So the first box is the scenario 1 where we see limited SDG uptake by both the communities, and we get a business as usual where country production of SDG and development data remains below potential. And of course, there's costly ad hoc parallel monitoring systems by donors, which end up missing synergies. In the second scenario, we can see that the SDG data generation does happen, but could be a donor-driven exercise, and the pressure on the NSO to produce the SDG data remains in addition to their normal business. Similarly, in the third one, we see that there's limited SDG uptake on the donor community, donor community side, which results in limited leveraging of the shared results framework for donor coordination and SDG financing, though we have the SDG data at the country level, but which would absorb a lot of capacity for already understrained NSOs. And scenario 4th is really what we want to motivate the case for today, where the country capacity to produce development data and SDG data expands with pooled and donor support. And there is also the scope for reusing these country statistics for their own monitoring and evaluation purposes, reducing overall costs. So we observe how these two communities respond to their different incentives, and often country may be stuck in some suboptimal scenario in boxes 1, 2, or 3. But this precisely underscores why we need to bring these groups together and enhance cooperation and convergence towards shared data and production and use.
In light of this, we have convened members of the PARIS21, the OECD, DAC results and evaluation communities, and the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation stakeholders to understand together to what extent can the SDG framework play a role in convergence across the communities in terms of shared production and use of development data and statistics. To facilitate this discussion, I would like to invite Mr. Rahul Malhotra, Head of Division at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, to facilitate a panel. Rahul, please.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Thank you, Archita. I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure to co-host this webinar with PARIS21. And so gratifying and wonderful to see the level of participation. We currently have 277 attendees and rising as I speak. So you're all very welcome. I hope that technology does not fail us over the next hour. But let's try and pack in as much of an interesting conversation as we can. I think Alejandro and Archita have set the scene fantastically well. I would just add one thing from my perspective, that I know there's a conversation after this one on COVID-19. I think given the situation that we're all in, it's very hard not to think and sort of discuss the issue of COVID-19. And I think in the context of the SDGs, we know that the policy and the data landscape is going to shift and transform. How fundamentally that will be, we will wait and see. But I don't preclude some thinking and conversation about COVID-19 as we seek to talk about alignment with the SDGs going forward. But I think with that, I really would like to dive into the panel conversation. We've got 3 fantastic panelists. The way we're going to do this is we're going to do a first round with the 3 panelists, just to talk about the state of play and to delve into some of those issues that Alejandro and Archita have spoken about in terms of challenges. but then a second round where we really cast the net forward and we think about how we might address some of those challenges and think to the future. I'm going to be very tough on time with the panelists. I apologize in advance, but we have very limited time and we want to hear from as many of you as possible. Please do post Q&A from the participants as we're speaking so that we can log some of those issues for the conversation later. So with that, I'm going to introduce the first panelist, that is Samantha Costa. I'm sure Samantha is very familiar to many of you. She is the Director of Policy Analysis at AID Data, which is a US-based, hello Samantha, which is a US-based research lab that has done a lot of very insightful analysis and pieces around data and data for development. So Samantha, first question to you, and you'll have about 4 to 5 minutes to respond. So we've heard that we're 5 years in, we're 10 years left around the SDGs. From your perspective, can you say a bit about what have you seen that has changed in the development data landscape since the inception of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs? And particularly, what kind of incentives have the SDGs created around data generation and use, both incentives that are positive and perhaps those that are less so? Samantha, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Rahul, for the great question and also for the invitation to join you today. So diving right in, I guess I would say as a starting point, when I think about a healthy development data ecosystem, I think of that really about 2 things. A supply of data to target resources, monitor progress, and evaluate results, first and foremost. And second, a healthy demand among decision makers to put this information to use in their work. And when it comes to the SDGs aligning supply and demand, I think what you've seen is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, SDGs, I think, have incentivized producers to be responsive to what their prospective data users want in 3 critical ways. First, I think the SDGs give data producers a mandate to go granular in line with user demand. Decision makers that we've spoken to routinely say they need more data that is disaggregated by geography and demography to better monitor hotspots of inequality within their countries. With its commitment to leave no one behind, the SDGs requires producers then to move beyond the tyranny of national averages towards greater disaggregation. Gender statistics, for example, is an encouraging case in point. Globally, we've seen the share of donor financing for statistics projects that incorporate gender disaggregated data has increased in the post-2015 period. At the national level, there's a great example of a National Statistics Office in Jordan collecting gender disaggregated data on labor market participation to report on SDG 5. And policymakers then use this information to make the case for the country to adopt new labor laws to improve gender equality. So a very positive note there. A second way that the SDGs have been a catalyst is to allow for the adoption of a common language with space to contextualize. While the MDGs were criticized for being top-down and donor-driven, the SDGs have given substantially more latitude for leaders to contextualize the agenda to fit national and local needs. So this has given flexibility for capacity-constrained communities like Patiala, India, to focus on a specific subset of the goals that were already aligned with their priorities. Meanwhile, in other cities, such as Los Angeles in the United States, they've chosen to revise some targets to better fit their local context, such as adjusting their poverty line target to reflect local economic realities. So in this respect, you could say that the SDGs set the stage for greater use of monitoring data because it better reflects an understanding of the local context, which is a high priority for end users, while facilitating comparability within this universal development agenda. The third way that I think the SDGs have been a catalyst is in nudging the official statistics community to broaden the tent. The sheer scope of the SDGs has made international organizations and governments mindful of the need to crowd in more than the usual suspects to close data gaps. The NSO certainly remains a central player in monitoring the SDGs, but there's also been a far greater emphasis than before on the complementary role of line ministries, as well as unofficial data producers from the private sector, academia, and civil society. And this could be mutually beneficial. NSOs produce more development data in many countries, but there are persistent trust deficits among prospective users. And I would say that closer cooperation with unofficial data producers could increase the credibility of NSO data, the visibility of unofficial sources, and promote methodological innovation. There's a whole host of great examples that I'd love to share, but I will reserve till later in the light of time. But as I alluded to at the start, it's a mixed picture. It's not all rosy. I think there are ways in which the SDGs have placed unprecedented strain on overstretched and under-resourced national statistics systems. So first, as many of you know, NSOs are being asked to do more without a commensurate increase in resources. There's been a modest increase in donor financing for statistics since 2015, but this resource infusion pales in comparison to the asks the SDGs make of NSOs. NSOs already struggled in the MDGs era to generate sufficient data to report on a much more bounded set of indicators and targets, and the SDGs represent an 8-fold increase in targets and a 4-fold increase in indicators compared to the MDGs. And moreover, data collection for the SDGs represents a greater challenge due to their complexity. 34 indicators still lack a defined methodology. I guess the last thing I'll say in terms of a major constraint is the fact that the SDGs has fueled a cottage industry of unofficial data producers without addressing underlying incentives that perpetuate inertia, duplication, or disuse. Donor financing for statistics as a long-term public good is far outstripped by parallel investments in project-level monitoring and evaluation. And these projects often produce rich granular data using innovative methods, but this information is often not publicly accessible or easily scalable to other contexts. And I think that the end result of this is that you have all of these disconnected initiatives that make integration, interoperability, and triangulation of data sources difficult. So maybe I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. That was great. In 5 minutes, I think you've covered the waterfront of the catalytic potential and limitations of the SDGs at a sort of systemic level. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn straight now to Andrea Reis Padmanabhan from Switzerland, who will also be very familiar to many of us, especially those of us that work in the development cooperation world. Andrea, you're very welcome. So Andrea used to work at the NSO in Switzerland and also the World Bank, and is now at the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, SDC, and is currently co-chair for the effectiveness working group around the effective global partnership for effective development cooperation, and a working group that has been established on effectiveness with the DAC. And Andrea, it's in that role and function that I would really welcome from you your thoughts on what we actually know today about partnership and partnership behavior around results and data between the development partners, and where you see this issue around aligning around the SDGs as a shared results frameworks, what you see as the state of play around that today from your vantage point. Andrea, please.
Thank you very much. As you indicated, we have this global partnership for effective development cooperation, which brings together partner countries, then the donors, but also non-state actor and private sector and multilateral. So it brings actually everybody together who is relevant in development and who could possibly also impact on a better data production. And we have an interesting sort of instrument is in this partnership to look and address effectiveness. I mean, Samantha has actually indicated there's a lot of sort of messiness and parallel and duplication around in an area where we have scarce resources. So it's useful to look how effective are we working together. And we have this this global monitoring system, which we typically do every 2 years, and look at key areas and monitoring the situation. And the last one was in end 2018, beginning of 19. And I just cite some of the key elements which are relevant for our our discussion. First, I mean, the good news is that national planning and monitoring and statistical system has improved significantly over the last decade. So if we look at the 86 partner countries who have actually participated in the monitoring, most of them have now new national development plans, and they incorporate SDG in their plans. So 80% have already done so, and I can assume that we are on a really good track. It's mostly due to the cycle of renewal of their national plan that they will step by step incorporate the SDG. So that's kind of the good news. Then the question is, I mean, all of them put indicators to those plans, but then the bad news is really there's a big gap there. Only 35 of the partners have actually the necessary data in their system to monitoring those national development plans. There we see, you know, the gap to actually the data system. So that's sort of the mixed picture we see when we look at the partner countries. Then when we look at the sides of the development partners, mostly the bilateral partners, you know, the good news also is that you know, most of them strengthen their monitoring and evaluation systems, and they have a strong focus on results, which is of course sort of, you know, incentivized also by the SDG system we have. And they also have incorporated SDG in their sort of planning and strategies. However, when you look at alignment to national plans and monitoring systems of partner country, this is slightly in decline. So we do see that development partners are pushed aside a bit to national priorities they have, rather than aligning to what actually their partner countries are doing. And only half of only half of the development partners, they do actually incorporate indicators from the SDG system. So about half of them are from the SDG system, and others are sort of other data. And that of course is very often because increasingly development partners have a drive to be accountable towards their own domestic constituency and parliament, rather than towards, you know, aligning with the partner country. So we see a bit this sort of shifting apart, which is a bit worrying. So overall, the picture we see is that there is indeed, as Samantha has already indicated, there's a proliferation of parallel monitoring and data collection processes in place, which of course is not very sensible in a context where we have very limited resources to do so. So in there, you know, the SDGs and the SDG indicator system, the common SDG indicator system we have, actually is an opportunity to better alignment, but it hasn't been taken up so far. That's what we see. Has been taken up at the level of sort of results, but when we go down to statistics and indicator, this is not at all the case yet.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. So clearly a lag in terms of catching up to this alignment agenda in terms of the behavior of some partners, which is of concern, but it's good that we have this evidence base in front of us in order to perhaps incentivize further action. I'm going to move quickly on to our final panelist, Dr. Dennis Mapper, which is great because I noticed that the first question in the Q&A is about the role of NSOs. So I think Dr. Mapper is going to be able to speak very eloquently to that issue as the National Statistician and Civil Registrar General of the Philippines Statistic Authority. Thank you very much, Dr. Mapper, for joining us. So we really do want to take advantage of your intervention here and to get down into the national level and really root this conversation into the realities. So Samantha spoke about the SDGs creating a common language with space to contextualize. And I guess it's that space to contextualize that we're really interested in here. Dr. Mappa, if you could say a bit about the extent to which the SDG domestication process has really affected the work, your work as the primary data producer in the Philippines. Dr. Mappa, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting us here and to share the the Philippine experience in this conversation. The Philippines' commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and the need to monitor the numerous SDG indicators, including necessary disaggregation, posed a great challenge to the Philippine statistical system, particularly the Philippine Statistics Authority. Hence, it was recognized that there's a need to assess the statistical capacities of the Philippine statistical system, to monitor the SDGs, provide good quality statistics, and to scale up a data ecosystem that will provide us the necessary skills, resources, and partnership to address the new information demands of the SDG. In response to this challenge, the Philippine Statistics Authority led the National Indicator Review and Mapping exercise in collaboration with our country's planning office. This was the first step in mainstreaming the SDGs to ensure inclusive and integrated approach to the adoption and implementation of the Philippine SDG indicators framework. The indicator review and mapping exercise was conducted through a series of multi-sectoral workshop and consultative meetings to identify available and relevant SDG indicators it would use for the monitoring. The development of the Philippine SDG indicator framework brought together various stakeholders, including new voices in the discussions, the data producers and users, development partners, members of the academe, the private sector, the media, and the civil society organization. This initiative was replicated at the sub-national levels, the regional and provincial levels, to ensure that no one is left behind in the discussion. This is important, we feel, in creating ownership of the SDGs to engage all data producers, sources, and users in the data ecosystem. As a result, a total of 155 Philippine SDG indicators for initial monitoring were agreed upon, of which 102 are global indicators, while 53 were tagged as proxy and supplemental indicators. The highest policymaking body for statistical matters in the country, the Philippine Statistics Authority Board, eventually approved the national indicators. In addition, prioritization was done to make sure that the SDG monitoring is funded and implemented in the country through the alignment of the SDG indicators to the result metrics of the Priority Development Agenda of the Philippines. This is what we call the Philippine Development Plan, our country's 6-year plan, and thus the SDG monitoring is sufficiently funded. 68 rather, of the 155 Philippine SDG indicators were initially in the PDP result matrix, and during the midterm updating of the plan, which happened early this year, all indicators were integrated into the Philippine Development Plan. And in order to leave no one behind, localizing the Agenda 2030 within our country was imperative. This is to say that mainstreaming the SDG into planning and implementation is done both at the national and sub-national levels, the regional, provincial, and city municipality levels, an action which requires innovative governance arrangement and practices that integrated both vertical and horizontal collaboration. The vertical collaboration is implemented through consultation processes and implementation of programs to achieve the SDGs at the national level, regional level, provincial, and municipal city level. On the other hand, strong collaboration between the national body and the different sectors of the economy, including the finance sector, environment, and social department, among others, was also critical. As a result of this collaboration, the regional and provincial consultation and assessment on the SDG, the Philippine Statistics Authority came up with the core regional SDG indicators, which are consistent with the initial list of the Philippine SDG indicators. So these indicators are tracked at the regional level. Finally, capacity development programs for the SDG have been identified and form part of the national strategy SDG for Development of Statistics, our Philippine Statistical Development Program in the country. And the country, in addition, continues to participate in various international and regional fora on SDG to be abreast on the current ongoings, both the technical side and the operational side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mappa. Thank you very much. That was very useful. There is actually a question that has been raised with me about to what extent are the SDGs really framing all statistical work in all our countries, as opposed to just adding another chapter in the statistical yearbook. And I think the same applies at the policy level as well as the statistics level. But I think your example of integrating and localizing and mainstreaming is really compelling, and it sounds like there's been a lot of progress there. But again, I would encourage participants to share their own experiences around this integration and localization agenda. Okay, well, thank you very much. You've all been extremely disciplined in terms of keeping to time, which is great. We do have time now before we open it up to question and answer for a quick second round. And I will make this very quick fire, but really to think forward and to think about in all of the potential, the opportunity and the constraints and challenges that you've all outlined, how do we really move this agenda forward? And I want to start with you, Andrea, if I may. So you've painted the very mixed picture that we're seeing from the global monitoring round in terms of the SDGs as a shared framework for results. What do you see? How are we really going to nudge behaviors around this? How are we going to change the incentives? How are we going to address that really core point that you made about accountability being facing domestically rather than in a more sort of mutual sense? Andrea.
Yes, I think we just have to walk the talk, and of course, if development partners, they will have to continue their different projects on a very specific level. But I think we have to sort of innovate and move forward the sort of central coordination system. And Mr. Mappa sort of painted a very interesting picture how that could look like. He took the example to the Philippines, where it actually goes down to the provincial level, and it's really a nationally driven process. So from our side, our contribution as global partnership is really take our members by the word, because they have sort of aligned to and have agreed to align to a couple of principles, and country ownership and focus on results and inclusive partnership and transparency and mutual accountability are sort of at the core of this commitment. So I think it's important that we walk the talk and look how we can take those principles forward and how we introduce them and look at them in the context of data. And that means also generally in the context of the Agenda 2030 that some of the core sort of coordination mechanism which most of the countries have in place between the partners and the government, and increasingly also with sort of other actors, that they are innovated and that they are further developed so that they take those issues in account. And one of the important area is that typically when we look at the donor coordination system, where we do talk with the government on their national development plan, typically the National Statistical Office is not sitting at the table. I mean, data, some were tucked as something technical, but it's not kind of part of that. And also the awareness of the development partner that you could actually do sector support to something as statistic. We have typically sector support to health and all sorts of areas, but very seldom this is actually, you know, the statistical system is seen as a sector which integrally needs support, that this is has to be sort of resought. So we have the potential with the SDG and with a common indicator framework that this can drive that, but we have yet to sort of innovate the places we coordinate that and we take that in account in order to really make that happen. And from the global partnership, we do have sort of taken data as something on board which will be a priority in our future work program, because we have the opportunity to bring all the actors together and look jointly how we can have a shared responsibility and how we can do that in a multi-stakeholder fashion, and how we can sort of coordinate and have incentives to really invest collectively and in a better and effective way in data. So that's sort of one of our next, one of our plans in the future work program. And we have had very good response from partner countries, but also from various development partners who would be interested. So hopefully in the future, if you have some sort of core coordination system in a country, you know, the national statistical system would be sitting at the table as a key actor, and there would be also be a target for investment, and there would be a common understanding that, you know, you have also to align to statistical priority of a country and not only sort of to other priorities in other areas. So that's how we want to push that forward.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And that of course is not just a technical problem. It's partly it's a political problem as well that we have to address both levels, which I know you're seeking to do now in this new work. Samantha, there's the same question to you. How do we walk the talk? I mean, you've spoken about the silos, you've spoken about the gaps, and dare I say it, you've spoken about the graveyards in some of your work around data. But so how do we work with the core of the national statistical systems, given that the tent is broadened and there's this duplication, multiplication going on in the data world? How do we bring it all together to walk the talk, Samantha?
Great, thank you for the question. You know, I think what we're talking about to walk that talk is that we're talking about change, and any change requires exertion, time, resources, political capital, and there's a lot of incentives to stick with the status quo. And so in my mind, I think overcoming the status quo means being mindful of the incentives of various groups and crowding in the interest of data funders, producers, and consumers to work in ways that add value to the SDGs. And so I have a couple of thoughts on that. So first, I think, you know, we should recognize that project level monitoring and evaluation is not going away. But I think funders could do more to make sure that their investments in this area are contingent on transparent disclosure of the data and methods, because that can actually spur experimentation, sharing, and scaling opportunities with the official statistics system. Second, I think that funders have unusual clout to be able to do matchmaking between official, unofficial, and project and monitoring and evaluation partners to encourage learning and innovation that will really be essential, particularly when we're talking about tackling tier 3 indicators that we don't have existing methods to do. One great example of this in practice is in Tunisia, where UNDP partnered with Global Pulse and the local NSO to employ social media metrics to work alongside an NSO survey to monitor progress against SDG 16. I think third, funders have an opportunity to reward examples of positive deviance. So what I mean by that is, you know, when you see NSOs and unofficial data producers bucking the trend towards inertia and silos and working in new ways, reward them for that. You know, so if they are validating third-party data, they're adopting new complementary methods, they're transparent in disclosing things. For governments, they have some responsibilities too. I think, you know, coordination and collaboration doesn't happen on its own, and many countries around the world have found the adoption of this idea of a chief data officer or a data champion to broker collaborations and break down silos between agencies and third-party actors as a good way to go. Second is that I think government should reward and recognize official producers for engaging citizens, companies, and CSOs as data co-creators and validators. Right now, that's seen as extra work that is pain and not gain. But I think that should be rewarded and encouraged. An example of this in Colombia was the Bogota Chamber of Commerce and the NSO working together on sharing data for select indicators, standardizing data formats, working together on data reporting. And the last two things real quickly I'll say is that producers should be more transparent in their methods and quality assurance procedures. I think, there's been a common refrain of lamenting the fact that many development cooperation partners themselves seem to not be using data produced by national statistical systems, and that's unfortunate. But that does point to a root issue there of lack of confidence, either if that data is not seen as particularly speaking to the felt needs that the development cooperation partner has, or that there's some uncertainty about credibility. And I think that being transparency with how you collect this data has actually, we have found, been associated with higher perceived credibility. And then finally, I think unofficial data producers should view building bridges with development cooperation partners and with NSOs as an opportunity. Unofficial data producers, myself and my institution included, are really, really good at experimenting with new ideas and difficult questions. We are horrible at bringing things to scale, and we need third-party validation that only NSOs can do. So that would be my appeal to get the incentives right. Thank you.
And Samantha, may I request just a very quick follow-up also on what you spoke about, the tyranny of national averages. Have you got any reflections on how we break that tyranny?
Yeah, several years ago, I wrote a report called Beyond Tyranny of the Averages, because there's an opportunity now with the shift from the MDGs era that was so focused on differences between countries, and with the SDGs, with the No One Left Behind agenda, there's an opportunity to go subnational. There's a much greater focus on the inequalities between groups of people within countries. And so I think there's an opportunity to learn actually from unofficial data producers when it comes to using georeference data to be able to get at hyper-local information. I think the Global Pulse example is a good one for that. And then also, the fact that a lot of this project level monitoring and evaluation data that I talked about before often includes very rich granular information on demographic attributes about vulnerable populations that typically are undercounted and underreported in official statistics. And I think that's a great example for potential gains from trade between unofficial and official data producers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Samantha, including your response to that impromptu question. So lots of very interesting observations there about transparency, about accountability, and about organization and management of statistical systems, which brings us neatly and finally to Dennis Mappa. If you could also reflect very briefly, Dennis, around the issue of walking the talk, and what you see as the role of NSOs in particular as being the core and the pivot for this agenda and for the alignment with the SDG agenda at a national level. Dennis.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to also align my discussion with what Samantha mentioned about transparency on the methodology and trust in the statistical offices of a country. So I think what we can contribute, the country's experience in this area is that one advantage of the Philippines is the legal framework for institutional organization for SDG data. The Philippine Statistics Authority plays a central role by being the official repository of SDG indicators and leads in the coordination for the generation and improvement of the indicators. The SDG monitoring in the Philippines is supported by a strong legal framework for SDG data through board resolutions of the highest policymaking body on statistical matters in our country, the Philippine Statistics Authority. Moreover, as I mentioned, very important is to really link the SDG indicators in the country's development plan. And in the case of the Philippines, the SDG indicators are actually embedded in the country's development plan, ensuring funding support for data generation and monitoring. In defining the coordination mechanism for the SDGs within the Philippine Statistics Authority and the Philippine Statistical System, we established in our country the Philippine SDG focal points. This group plays a vital role in the methodological development of the SDG indicators. We are transparent in terms of how we measure the SDG indicators by engaging the different national government agencies. So our focal group consists of about 34 members from the different national government agencies. In addition, the Philippine SDG data flow and national data flow and reporting mechanism for SDG indicators are guided by the global data flow has been approved by our highest policymaking body for both the national SDG indicators monitoring and the methodological development. And in addition, the dissemination of SDG by featuring our SDG Watch, which currently contains 2 data points of our Philippine SDG indicators, our baseline and updated data, has been useful for policymakers to inform them as to the improvement on the monitoring. However, there are actually challenges, and the challenges in a way, in our experience, also created opportunities. The challenge is the clamor for more disaggregated data to support development planning and decision making. And such demand for data has been increasing geometrically in our country. And overall, the Philippine statistical system calls for an innovative approach in harnessing data. Now, I'd like to cite one particular concern that we are facing, and in a way, the walking the talk, as you mentioned, the response of our policymaker. I think one concern really is the lack of mechanism or the capacity, the ability to collect data at the local level, the city, municipal level. And in our case, that is actually a problem. But last year in the Philippines, a law in reaction to this data demand, a law was enacted in the Philippines adopting a community-based monitoring system for the whole country. And this would generate up-to-date and disaggregated data necessary for targeting beneficiaries and conducting more comprehensive poverty welfare analysis and in designing the appropriate policies. However, we see it because the Philippine Statistics Authority was tasked to lead the community-based monitoring system. The PSA sees this as an opportunity to generate disaggregated SDG indicators and to monitor progress, to generate more reliable poverty statistics, estimates at the municipal, local level, and to involve the other actors to strengthen their statistical capacity for a local digital data ecosystem. And this will provide an opportunity to promote the use of statistical standards at the local level, as well as to link the local level planning and program implementation with the national level decision-making process. So these are things that are ongoing in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mappa. We clearly have a lot to learn from the Philippines example, and thank you for sharing that with us. So look, we've had some really fascinating insights now from the 3 panelists. We've got 318 participants on this call, and I wish I could hear from each and every one of you. And it's certainly more than we would be able to entertain in a room in Paris. So this clearly works quite well. We do have a little bit of time now for question and answer. What I'm going to do is we've had three people actually who have asked for the floor. I will turn to them. At the same time, I will be looking at the Q&A and trying to distill some core questions out of that for the panelists to come back on at the end. And then I will hand over to Johannes to wrap up. So may I call on Dr. Bile Begashaw, who's the Director General of the SDG Center for Africa, to raise an issue, a comment or a question. Dr. Begashaw.
Thank you, Rahul. Can you see me? Yeah, I guess.
We can.
All right. Thank you. This is wonderful. And thank you for inviting us and also taking this initiative, which is extremely timely initiative. Let me put it this way. First, I think there is no doubt that the interdependence and complexity of the SDG program seek for high quality and accessible, reliable, and timely and disaggregated kind of data's capacity at all levels. This is obvious. And if we see how this works right now, particularly where I come from and where actually I actively involved on SDG monitoring system, Africa. We see three important constraints right now. The first one is, of course, the data gap is obviously way beyond our expectation. According to 2017 report, only 37% of the indicators have actually report at countries level, data at countries level. That is clear. The second important constraint is consistency of this data, even for tier 1 data. Even in countries where the statistics operation mechanism is relatively better, we still have this constraint of inconsistencies. But the third and most important thing is access to data. Let me put it very clearly why we're saying this. The data that is used for monitoring and evaluation, the data that comes as an index annually, only targeting certain group of people when it comes to who is actually benefiting from the report itself. Only policymakers, politicians are access to this kind of data because indexes are meant to be read and understood by this kind of people. The SDG cares about the bottom 30–40% of the population, and this population still do not have access to any of these data. So unless we bring this data, this report to the citizens level, we will not be able to make sure empowerment of these people, and also to make sure that this very attractive slogan of no one would be left is. The second important issue is on domestication itself. I heard actually Philippines' experience. I heard also from other speakers. The domestication is one important aspect of actually SDG implementation process. But in my experience, in our experience, in most of the countries in Africa, the domestication is at best actually is aligning the SDGs into national agendas. For us, the most important part of domestication should be how we can contextualize those targets and indicators and interpret and translate them into local actually constructs, so that interventions could locally be identified and reported toward that. Until we do such a thing, we would not feel that the domestication process is done. And this is a major constraint that we are having right now. And the third important thing is whether in data generation or data use, it's only government and government system is now actively involved. I believe government is custodian for this program. This program should be implemented by all citizens, non-government institutions, NGOs, and all others, whether it's health, education, agriculture. The big part of the operation is done by non-government organizations. So we were encouraging, and we've been still pushing on this when we produce indexes, annual reports, dashboards, and all these things. All agencies, with the government should sit down and discuss where exactly that country stands among the crowd, and also identify the gaps, and also discuss how to change the gears and push agendas forward. Secondly, we want also, we build actually a system that how each of these parties could report, at least at national level, to the statistics office, where the coordination could be done. But that statistics office should synthesize and also encompasses every detailed information that comes through that software to make it a national report. Unless we engage this kind, non-governmental institutions who are doing the big part of the work, we would not feel that the SDG reporting is exhaustively done at countries level. So I know that time is an essence here. I'm not going to add anything, but let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Begashaw, and I'll allow the panelists to reflect on those comments as we hear from others Next is Oliver Chinganya, Director of the African Centre for Statistics at UNECA.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see me. And thank you for the discussions and the panelists, and also the intervention from the Director General of the SDGs. I'm just going to reflect on a few things, and I'll start by saying that I think the effort of countries and the community at the global level to achieve the SDGs has now been stalled because of the coronavirus, which is ravaging the societies and impacting economic and social settings. Statisticians and planners are not in position to compare the report and monitor the SDGs in 2020. Most of the data required is collected through personal interview, but of course now with the COVID-19, this is not possible. It doesn't allow for that. The effect is probably likely to last for the next 3 years or so, and that to mean leaving the global community with just about 5 years to deliver the SDGs, and maybe even less. In fact, it's likely that the year 2020 and the next few years risk to be the years with the unreliable indicators. The question I would like to ask the panelists is, how will statisticians fill the gap? Do they need to partner with other stakeholders, such as universities, research institutions, private sector, to develop different approaches of collecting data, or even modeling, developing models to estimate indicators, including estimating census results, given that some of the countries that are planning for their to collect their census this year are likely to cancel or even postpone their censuses. Perhaps maybe this is the time to also review the partnership and perhaps also look at how to use how countries can actually use aid money. The other related questions I would like the panelists to reflect on is two things. One is that is COVID really maybe a blessing in disguise as a stimuli to leapfrog the implementation of SDGs? And the second part that I would like them to look at is that what is really the future of official statistics, especially that the fundamental principles of the UN fundamental principles of official statistics somehow do not embrace the big data. So I would like the panelists just to reflect on those questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And finally, I'm going to call on Sumya Chattopadhyay from ODI. Sumya, over to you. If you could be very brief, please.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear and see me. Two comments. One is basically a reflection on the fact that we are building the need for SDG indicators on as an architecture which was designed for less granular, less frequent data gathering, without putting in the resources at both international level as well as at the national level. The capacity to deliver the sort of relevant information is fairly limited. So unless we tackle that kind of the elephant in the room, there is only that much we can progress in terms of delivering what is needed. And it reflects in the fact that about 48% of the indicators are still in tier 2 and or tier 3, and we haven't made much progress there. In reflecting to a point that Samantha had mentioned about incentives, one of the key things that we have seen in some of our research is when we see, I mean, there is obviously this incentive gap between devising a system and being able to use it. But in countries, in illustrations where we've actually seen that disaggregated information, whether that's generated by the NSOs or other non-governmental organizations, are actually being used in the active deliberations, in active policymaking, and there is a natural sort of transition into the outcomes or how funding flows or how initiatives are then designed and practiced. That builds a fair amount of legitimacy in being able to open up, share data, and then actually make that more mainstream in the process. So that's one of the ways, but it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem that you can't build legitimacy unless you have good data, and you need good data to build the legitimacy. So how do we break that cycle? In some cases, some countries and some specific sectors have been much more effective than in others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumya. So I'm going to pass over for very, very brief reflections from our three panelists. I've done a very quick dive into the Q&A, and I have to say it's very hard to digest all of it in such a short space of time. But in the Q&A, well, first of all, I think, you know, this is a conversation that clearly needs to continue, and there's a lot of interest in it. I think some of the questions speak to issues around how we deliver a real sort of really the transformative agenda of 2030 and create a paradigm shift in statistical systems and support to statistical systems beyond the rhetoric. There's a set of questions about what can we do at the global level and not just at the country level in order to reduce fragmentation. There's a set of issues about funding, and particularly one issue around in the context of COVID-19. We know vital statistics are going to be absolutely fundamental. How can we make sure that donors are investing in those vital statistics in support of national efforts? A set of issues about non-official statistics, the role of and the ownership for non-official statistics, and also a set of issues around user engagement. And then finally, at the country level, so some questioning about whether the Philippines is an exception rather than the rule. And I think a desire to exchange more experiences across a broader range of countries, and also particularly to address this issue of capacity building within the national context and how we can really make sure that we're investing in the capacities. But in the interest of time, I'm going to give each of the panelists 1 minute to quickly reflect. And let's start with you, Dr. Mapa, if we may.
Oh, thank you very much for that comments. I got a lot of good comments, but I'd like to focus really on the issue of domestication of this SDG indicator. In particular, how the local planners can actually make use of the data. That means disaggregating this data. In the case of the Philippines, it was really the demand for the demand of our policymakers, both at the local level and our legislators, for disaggregated data. And I think our case, at least for my country, it's really engaging our legislators, policymakers, that they need to invest in data generation, not just at the national level, but also at the local level. And in our experience, we're quite successful in convincing our policymakers to provide funding support in generating disaggregated data through what we call the community-based monitoring system. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea.
Maybe I would like to pick on some questions which have been related to the funding, and I mean that representing also a development partner. I think we need to reflect on that, particularly also with COVID-19. I think the priorities are going to shift and money is going to be scarce. So that's really going to be a big issue. And my vision, my view would be that we have been trained as, you know, giving on the bilateral or multilateral area, giving funding, that it's quite natural, and it goes without saying that we reserve some resources for M&E of a project. And in the same vein, I think we need to be trained, and it should be quite natural that if we engage in investing in a particular sector in a country, that we have to also reserve some resources to animate a statistical system which helps us to see how we perform. And that statistical system is not at the discretion of every actor, but it really should be something we agree on beyond sort of government to government, but also with stakeholders. So in the context of the Agenda 2030, we do have a stakeholder approach, and it's quite clear that it needs more than government to sort of get business done. So it will also need more than governments to actually find statistics, to share them, and to agree what are sort of the basic statistics we need. So hopefully we can over time have a sort of a similar understanding that part of our investment always has to go to that sort of basic statistic system.
Thank you. Samantha.
Great questions. A lot to cover. First, thanks to Samia for his great question. So just to summarize, that was kind of about the chicken and egg problem between you. In order to have legitimacy, you need to have good underlying data, but to have good underlying data, that also is a reflection on your legitimacy. I guess what I would say to that is, I had an opportunity to have a window into working with a development cooperation partner who was helping a country open up its data via an open data portal for the first time. And pretty late in the process, there was a realization that a lot of the spatial information of the locations of health clinics and schools were wrong. And so there was this question about, oh, what do we do? This data has to be accurate. And it actually created a discussion around, well, is there a way to actually engage local citizens, local communities that, if you think about who would have the best information on where their local school or clinic is located, they would. And so that created new windows of opportunity to have legitimacy through transparency. Second thing I'll say to the the COVID-19 related intervention, I think what I think COVID-19 tells us about in relation to this overall question of inertia and status quo is that, when you have an emergency like COVID-19, we all know that the status quo is insufficient. It's urgent. It requires action now. We know that the old methods don't work. We need something new. And so that creates opportunities for people to take risks. It reduces the barriers to cooperation because it removes competition. It creates kind of a net, an opportunity to work together. And I think that while I would not want to recreate an emergency like COVID-19, I think there are ways in which we can learn from that in terms of SDG monitoring in future to say, how do you remove some of those dangers of taking risks and encourage cooperation? On the first intervention that was made, I think, it was a brief discussion around the fact that there's so much of this project level monitoring and evaluation information that's looking at specific groups of people, and that information is not transparent or readily available, and that's a missed opportunity. And I would agree with that. I think there's some cause for hope, though. There are a few donors that have actually made moves in this area. So USAID and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are examples of this, where they have required their implementing partners to disclose all monitoring and evaluation data. And I think that's radically changed the incentives for those providers, and I think we need to do more of that. The last thing I'll say briefly was a question that was in the, the Q&A chat, which I really liked, which was asking about the credibility of unofficial statistics, the credibility of unofficial statistics and monitoring and evaluation of the SDGs. And I think that that is a really critical piece. I think the Philippines example that was raised earlier about the NSO serving that coordinating, validating role, but broadening the tent to embrace the role of monitoring and evaluation providers is really critical. And I think that can go both ways. I think unofficial producers can help validate and increase the perceived credibility of official data. And I think official statistics would benefit from having their own data production processes validated by third parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you to the three of you for really, really fascinating interventions. I only wish we had more time and could do justice to the Q&A as well. I think we've got a very clear message about walking the talk, and that time is not on our side, and we really need to move this agenda forward now and stop talking about it. And I think we will certainly play our role as the OECD in terms of moving this agenda of the SDGs as a shared results framework forward. And we'd like to have more of these conversations around this agenda. But I will not seek to summarize. I'm going to leave that to my partner, Johannes Jutting, the executive head of PARIS21. Johannes, over to you.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure for me to try to summarize this great webinar. First of all, Rahul, let me thank you for moderating this panel, and thanks to all the panelists for being so concise and also for sharing so many interesting facts on this topic. From my perspective, this webinar is part of the PARIS21 board meetings, like another webinar on the COVID, which I invite you also to join, which will start in just 25 minutes after this one. Is very interesting to see how we can relate and how the different frameworks can relate to each other. From my side, there are three main messages I want to take away from this seminar. I'm just checking in. Can you hear me all right, Rahul?
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of the main messages that I take away from the seminar so far is really one is the timeliness of the seminar. And it has been said, I mean, I was thinking about the Busan conversation, the Busan action plan on statistics and the Busan conversation we had just a couple of years ago, where we to some extent missed the boat to bring together both the statistical community and the development cooperation community. And I think now, 5 years after the SDGs, we really feel the need. It's time to move together, and it's time to exchange more between a national statistical office head like Dennis from the Philippines and Andrea from an aid agency. And I mean, of course, there were conversations before, but what we have seen as PARIS21 in the past, those conversations were done in very different parts of this world and in very different parts of the conversation, so that different strands. So in that sense, moving both together is great. And we also had the former head of the European of Eurostat with us, and he was asking this one very interesting question about the SDGs as a results framework for all of us. So bringing statistics and policy making together at this time is critical. So the time is really ripe for more of those conversations. The second point I wanted to make is we talked about what could be interesting entry points. And I think the one critical point I take away is the nucleus of bringing us together is the national plans, the national development plans. And I think the Philippine example again, but there are many others. I saw one of the question, are there other countries? Yeah, there are other countries where countries have made an effort to adapt the SDGs to their national plans. That should be the nucleus. And then donors, as well as the national statistical offices, could and should align to this national development plan. And the national, for the national statistical community, this is relatively easy because they have the national development plans on statistics, the NSDSs. And as we have heard also a couple of examples also by Samantha and others, this is very easy also to bring in other data providers, the unofficial data providers. So in that sense, this is very good, and I think we should use much more of those national plans and augment those national plans and bring those two communities together. Last but not least, I want to say what's next for us. This is just the beginning. We have, I think, as you said, Rahul, there are different work streams. There is the OECD work stream on data for development. There is the work stream of the Global Partnership of Effective Development Cooperation. PARIS21 is part of the Bern network on better financing. So the one thing that clearly stands out is to continue those conversations. And we have a couple of opportunities. There will be the World Data Forum, the UN World Data Forum. We don't know yet how it will happen, but there will be hopefully something. So there will be the opportunity to bring the different strands together. And I really do hope we can leverage on this, and we see this as a starting point. And with this, I do hope you enjoyed this conversation. I do hope you will be in touch with us and we can go forward. And with this, I really want to thank you all of you for asking great questions, for engaging, and also for the panelists for being part of this. I wish you a wonderful day and hope to be in touch soon. Thank you so much.